Hello, Lone, and welcome to this presentation and analysis of the text Dracula's Guest. And the story is an excerpt of a Gothic short story named Dracula, which was published in 1914 after the author Bram Stoker's death. The story includes a lot of Gothic fictional characteristics, such as the gloomy setting. Um, the story takes place in the outskirts of Munich in the beginning of summertime and is described quite detailed. And via the the detailed setting, the author builds up the climax of the short story. He describes the setting as the setting is at nighttime during a thunderstorm at a graveyard in like a deserted village, and you can almost feel that something is going to happen to the protagonist. And this like gloomy setting during a foggy and dark and stormy night is often one of the central characteristics of Gothic fiction, where stories often take place in like deserted places, as well as during the night to make the the reader like get an uncanny feeling. And the short story is partly real, but also includes imaginary examples. For instance, the fact that he stays at a Four Seasons hotel uh, is like a real life example. It exists in Munich, and an imaginary part of the story could be that he's at this graveyard where he senses that he's not alone. He can feel the dead people under him at this Valpurgis night, uh, and he feels like something's going to happen to him, and then he gets attacked by a giant wolf. Yeah, and yeah, as I mentioned, the story was published in 1914, and a few pieces of information is included in this story about the historical period, and I think it shows the technological development from 1914 until today. Um, for example, the coach, which probably would be a car today, and the fact the soldiers ride horses and not in vehicles, and that the message sent by Dracula is by telegram. Today it would probably be sent by mail. The short story is written as a first person narrator, which means that the story is told through like one person's thoughts, and yeah, the characters in the story are described by what they're saying and what they're doing. We don't really have any examples of um, descriptions of their looks and some of their feelings, except for the protagonist, whose feelings and thoughts are described quite thoroughly. For example, he feels that something is weird and uncanny about like the place, and it made him feel quite faint. And the narrator or the author uses different narrative modes, such as dialogue, direct and indirect speech, and also descriptions. The short story includes three characters: Johann, the protagonist, and the man at the reception, Herr Delbruck, and their personalities and looks don't really play a role in the story. It doesn't mean anything for for the plot. And now onto the structure of the story. The story starts in medias res and very quickly draws the reader's attention um, as he introduces the setting of the story, um, and mentions that the story takes place on a special spiritual night called Valpurgis night, where like the undead come to life and come up from the graves to haunt the living. Yeah, and by mentioning stuff like that, it takes place on Valpurgis night. Like the suspense of the story is built up bit by bit, and creates like an uncanny feeling for the reader. And he also does this by mentioning wolves, nervous horses who can like feel that something bad is going to happen, and also this stormy weather, which is often is a symbol for that something bad is going to happen soon. And the suspense curve of the story peaks at the point where the protagonist is caught by a giant wolf, and yeah, after he seems to become unconscious. And I think one of the central themes of the genre is to create this uncanny feeling for the reader by using the setting, and create this displeasure for the reader. And yeah, this displeasure is something that a lot of people seek, and therefore the genre has grown a lot in the last few years. It's very interesting, as it is a very interesting genre. Um, and yeah, now onto the ending of the short story, which I feel is quite surprising and very unpredictable. As we learn that the reason why Herr Delbruck sends out these horsemen to search for the protagonist is the fact that he receives a telegram from Dracula, who is from Transylvania and half wolf and half human. And I think the fact that he is half wolf and half human is quite funny for the story, as the protagonist is attacked by a wolf and is a human. Um, and yeah, it's like an open ending, open and mysterious ending, which like leaves the reader thinking and asking questions to what is going to happen next. On to how the short story relates to the genre of Gothic fiction. It includes several of the traits from the genre. Um, like it has these supernatural elements in the shape of Valpurgis Night being mentioned, where dead people come to life, and it has this uncanny plot, which creates suspense for the reader, um, and it also includes heroes, um, such as the comrades and the horseman who saves the protagonist from dying from this wolf attack, and these intense emotions, horror, in the shape of that the protagonist is very close to dying, and it also includes a feeling of mystery, as both the reader and the protagonist don't really know what's going to happen next in the story. The protagonist seems quite like confused, and generally the story is quite unpredictable. For example, the ending where the protagonist receives the news that Dracula has informed the Herr Delbruck from the hotel that he needs to take care of yeah, the protagonist. And but generally, I think the story and the main trait from the genre is the gloomy setting, as it is described numerous times, and yeah, is what makes or creates this suspense for the reader. Chosen to relate the text to other texts from the genre Gothic fiction. I've chosen the story about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which also takes place on a gloomy night under the floodlights. And also in this story, mystery plays a huge part, as they're looking for something in a drawer, and the reader is like quite confused during the story. And I've also chosen Frankenstein, and that's because like the presence of death is in both stories, and like the monster in Frankenstein, I think it relates kind of to the giant wolf in Dracula's Guest, and the story also partly takes place in a graveyard, as it also does in Dracula's Guest.